we will not condone what Russia is doing. We will not condemn what Russia is doing. It's very much, we see it. You do what you're going to do, Russia, but don't count on us.
This is The Global Gambit.
Greetings, Internet. It's your boy. It's Piotr back. And this time around, we're talking Central Asian region, STANs, what's known colloquially as the STAN countries, half a dozen or so countries in Central Asia, which all end in Stan. And back with me to break down these countries, which I consider to be a little bit overlooked in often international relations and geopolitics, is a friend of the channel. I hope I could say friend of the channel, Professor Michael Rossi. Good to see you, sir. I believe you're back in the United States of America, right? At the moment?
Back in the US of us, yes, absolutely. Here for the last month and a half here. So yes, back in the States. Good to be here. Good to be back with you on the channel.
Well, thank you. And you're going back, I believe, relatively soon. But what I am interested to know is there for a while. And one of the things I wanted to first break down in this episode with your professional experience, given the first episode was more about your YouTube journey, is what's it like living out? I believe you've mainly been based in Tashkent, but I mean, I've been to mainly Kazakhstan. I think the first country I ever visited at 6 months old. So how do you view, as someone who's been not just living there, but teaching there, the STANs as a whole?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that always comes to everyone's mind when they finally go out there, and usually it is either Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan. Those are the top three. Tajikistan and Turkmenistan are a little more obscure, but usually the first thing that they think of is that it breaks their conceptualized expectations of what Central Asia is. I think that the region is sort of hobbled with this stereotype of being in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, with names that end in Stan, they kind of evoke this this idea of some godforsaken third world country where basic utilities are just a new feature or whatever, right? And then you go out there. And you see cities like Tashkent and Almaty, Astana, and you begin to realize that these are not just major urban centers, but they're quite modern, right? They're quite cosmopolitan. They're quite contemporary. They are very much on par with most other European, Russian, Baltic, Ukrainian cities. They were major Soviet cities in their times.
When you say that, is it a case of that it's about the infrastructure or the education of the population, or a multitude of different factors?
I think it's a little bit of everything here. The architecture is, we tend to think that these places are just kind of living in time capsules since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's not necessarily the case at all. Now, I have to qualify this by saying that, these presumptions are now, I think, increasingly outdated as the region becomes more and more focused on by the rest of the world. But there still is this sense of awe and surprise among many people that they find modernity and development, on par with the rest of the world in this part of the world. And I think a lot of it has to do, unfortunately, with a lot of stereotypes and a lot of misconceptions about that part of the world too.
So one of the things that also comes to mind is the way that these countries are categorized. So in academic jargon, some people have categorized the STANs as competitive authoritarian states in this sort of sense that they've not really had much political or civil liberty, but they've had decent economic growth. So to use Kazakhstan as an example for viewers, Kazakhstan has seen a consistent growth in the past, 30 years that Nazarbayev, the previous leader of the country, oversaw. Since then, he stood down, I think 2019, and was replaced by Tokayev, and that has continued largely speaking. But one of the things that we've seen over time is consistently and periodically protests, grievances by the population over various things, and it often boils down to the lack of what they think is, free and fair elections or representation, and so on. What's your perception on those sorts of themes? Is that accurate, or is it more? It's not. It's less about that and other factors.
I think it's a little bit of that. Obviously, you touched on something very accurate here, and that is that most of the region, or let me qualify that even more by saying Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, the top three here, are certainly within that model.
When you say
Where
top three, do you mean what, demographically or geographically? Or
I would just say top three in just terms of development, modernity,
okay.
in that sense. And the reason why I don't include Tajikistan and Turkmenistan in this are for two different reasons. But let me just go through this. Tajikistan right now is still under the leadership, the control of longtime President Emomali Rahman. He is widely considered by the population to just kind of be like this father, grandfather figure within the country. There's no open protest. There is no real vocal grievance among the population, right? They've made their peace. He is going to be there until he decides to step down. But when it comes to infrastructure, technology, modernity, there's a clear difference between that country and, let's say, neighboring Uzbekistan. And then when it comes to Turkmenistan, this is basically the North Korea of Central Asia. And I know that I've said this probably once already on your channel, but it's worth repeating. It is actually easier for an American to go to North Korea than it is Turkmenistan today. And we have diplomatic relations with Turkmenistan. So the reason behind this is simply because the country is closed. The borders have been shut since COVID. It's just almost well nigh impossible for a non-Turkmeni citizen, passport carrying Turkmeni citizen, to go to the country unless you are some, high-end foreign diplomat. So the country just remains just relatively closed off. So we have no idea what's really going on behind the scenes. So that leaves us with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And in these three countries, there is this, without knowing the details of the region, we just tend to think someplace Stan, right? We can't tell the difference. We don't know the difference between Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. We can't even, place this on the map. Those that have been there, right, have noted exactly as you pointed out that there is notable economic growth and development. Modernization is certainly apparent in the major cities. But political rights and civil liberties remain tightly controlled by the state.
Yes.
All of these countries will say officially that there is some political pluralism within the country, right? So this is not a single party state, at least as far as looking at the official records and saying there's 2, 3, 4 other political parties that are out there. Now, the chances of these parties getting elected and overturning the government is, statistically null at this point, right? So, hence the whole notion of competitive authoritarian governments. But the understanding is that, at least among the ordinary people, is that as long as the governments provide some kind of modest, sustainable, steady growth in terms of purchasing power, modern features of life, the general comforts that one can get from consumerism and materialism, then the average citizen is not going to really get up in the morning wondering or wishing if there could be, true political dynamism within the country. And this takes, I think, from a page from the Chinese playbook. This idea that the Chinese Communist Party is really not interested in instilling any kind of ideology beyond the whole notion of national security, stability, and structural growth should eventually, down the road, in the God knows when, but down the road, provide future political pluralism, but don't expect that anytime soon.
So that makes me think of is this general, again, theme where I personally think we're on this, you can put, as I think we've touched upon as well, everything on a political spectrum in the sense of full-fledged democracy over here, and then totalitarianist state, i.e., so what's the most free state? I don't know, someone like New Zealand or something, and then over here, North Korea, right? But in that, you've got this debate going on amongst countries. How much centralization of control do we want? Singapore's a fantastic example of this, where they do have elections, but it's been run by the same country for years, but they've seen really steady economic growth for decades. And so what I think governments are grappling with, and we as a population are as well in the West or wherever, is how much do we want to balance civil and political freedoms versus economic stability? Because the more centralized the state is, the more likelihood there is economic stability, but you don't have as much freedoms. And so countries that are developing their own models of, I don't know, governance, look at, the Chinese model, they look at the US, they look at everybody else, and they're like, what do we want? Do we want to follow a more pluralistic secular state, which is free, but there maybe experiences more boom and busts? Or do we want a more centralized country that has, less freedoms, but we can retain some economic prosperity for everybody? Well, that's how that's again, the very perhaps idealistic academic interpretation. But what's your sense of that amongst the 5 countries, and also their relationship to their main, I think, influencer, Russia, at this point?
Right. One really good way of looking at this was a couple of months ago. I don't remember whether this was last fall or last spring, but within the last year, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken comes to the region and visits Tashkent for a couple of days. Certainly makes news, but most people aren't really all that excited about it. He's going to say the expected platform statements about the need for expanding political rights and civil liberties and how America champions democracy, this, that, the other thing, right? He's going to say it because he has to say it. But at the end of the day, he knows that the United States does not have the same type of diplomatic leverage in the region as, let's say, Russia or China does. So at the end of the day, when the cameras stop rolling, it's exactly that. What is more important, national security or civil liberties? And, civil liberties are championed in countries where, national security has already been solved and are also deeply within the economic sphere of the United States. And we can talk about civil liberties.
But you say national security, but can we in some ways frame it that it's national security under it's actually survivalism of the regime or government under the guise of national security, right?
Well, yes, but one way of looking at it in this way is think post-Cold War, think less 20th century, where national security was just simply controlling the media, controlling the borders, and controlling the way that you thought. Today, national security is largely propped up by economic development, in which the governments can then say, look at what we've done for our population, right? People whose purchasing power is increasing over the last couple of years. The general accoutrements of modernity are here. Compare where you were 5 years ago. Between now, the people in power are the ones that provided all of this for you, and the general person in the street is going to say, fine, everything is good. So in this regard, we can talk about sort of the cosmetic elements of civil liberties, but at in reality, the primary goal is still economic development. So you mentioned the Singapore model, which a lot of these countries like to use, although I have to say, don't compare yourself to Singapore, because Singapore is basically a city-state. It's a business park that somehow was able to get UN membership, right? And it's been run by the same family. Now, what's interesting is that there is this is the quiet part that sometimes makes it out into the public, is that a lot of these governments want to make it a family-run enterprise, like Singapore, but that's generally looked down upon. The Singapore model of, laying down the law of what you need to do in order to, live a, nice, quiet, safe life here, coupled with the opportunities for building a business, expanding growth, working with other countries. This idea that a better, stronger economy will give you down the road the types of political rights and civil liberties that you want. That's the model, right? That's the strategy that's being employed. I can speak more so for Uzbekistan than the others. And that is, over the past 6 to 7 years, the country has experienced an explosion of growth, right? Since the new president has come to power, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, he has opened the country up from the relative isolation of the previous era under Islam Karimov. And that's enough to sell to the vast majority of the population on how much the country has improved, progressed, grown, industrialized. We're not just simply talking about a redoubling of investments with Russia. We're also talking about expanding cooperation with China, with India, with Iran, with Turkey, and of course the United States as well, right? The US, certainly their biggest presence within the region is really the expansion of the consumerist market. So we're really looking at, when will Tashkent get their first Starbucks, right? That's the big thing. Like there's so many of my students are saying there's Starbucks in Kazakhstan. Why don't we have this in
really?
Uzbekistan?
So it's that much of a ticking time, sort of like counting down the days to you get your first Starbucks, like that.
It's just one of those things where it's not so much that Tashkent doesn't have coffee houses. They just don't have Starbucks. That's a status symbol. And the fact that you can get Starbucks, not just in Almaty, Kazakhstan, which is to be expected, but Shymkent, which I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you have no idea where Shymkent is. It's right on the other side of the Uzbek border. We're not exactly talking about a place where you voluntarily go to for vacation. No, apologies to anybody from Shymkent, but it's basically like the first major city on the other side of the border, and you can get Starbucks there. And Tashkent is, a growing cosmopolitan city. And interestingly enough, a good number of my students are saying, why don't we have a Starbucks? When are we going to get a Starbucks? So the idea that the United States has this, this continued soft power, but soft power through consumerism means that means, when are we getting another Wendy's? When are we getting a Burger King? But most importantly, when are we getting a Starbucks? Because we get a Starbucks, all right, we have now reached another major benchmark.
Yeah, it's a form of public diplomacy. It's cultural diplomacy. It's culinary diplomacy. The Italians are great at utilizing certain foods, and the British are very good at leveraging things like the BBC or football leagues as a way to emphasize British culture. Although, frankly, I think the football culture of the UK is rather horrendous. So when you talk about then, mainly Tashkent, but then you mentioned it also, like multi-vector policy. That's what I think academics have utilized to describe certain countries in this region and how they balance, engagement with the West without trying to anger or embroil themselves in diplomatic crises with Russia or China. But how do the countries view, in your opinion, what's going on in Ukraine at the moment? How do they perceive the war? Maybe we can unpack that a little bit and then see where we are.
Officially, all of these countries are neutral. And I remember last February, when I was over there, the war had just begun. And the Uzbek government had issued one statement very shortly after. I think it was like a day afterwards. And it was something to the effect of, we see what's going on. We understand Russia's position in this, but we are not getting involved. We are not coming. We will not condone what Russia is doing. We will not condemn what Russia is doing. It's very much, we see it. You do what you're going to do, Russia, but don't count on us to be vocal allies. right, in this war. So if you were expecting us to align up with you like Belarus, that's not going to happen. And that was it. Right. And that was it. As far as the general population is concerned, it really is a generational thing. So, the older folks, and these are the ones that tend to get most of their news from, the evening news on TV, whether it's Russian speaking or the local language speaking. They tend to understand Russia. They tend to side with Putin. They think that Zelensky is a puppet of the West. They think that Ukraine is escalating conflict unnecessarily. They think that they are bringing in just unwanted destabilization within the region. They think that Zelensky is at best naive in thinking that NATO is going to rescue the country. And, at worst, he's just little more than a manipulated puppet. Younger you go, it kind of, diversifies a little bit more. And I can't really give a good percentage of all of this, but I would say that the plurality, the students at the university level, they're not Putin fanboys. That's certainly the case, but they also find it hard to swallow. They find the argument from the US, the UK, the EU, NATO hard to swallow. The idea that Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty, for its democracy. They kind of look at NATO and they say, well, look at what you did to Iraq, to Libya, to Afghanistan, to Syria. What makes this really, any different? Yes, you do get students, you do get people that are absolutely on the, the West's side, but it's largely diversified. And I know that in the West, I mean, the media is effectively one of the biggest weapons for advancing a particular narrative. I know that 6 to 8 months ago, it was, incredibly risky in the West to kind of talk about an understanding of the conflict, an interpretation of the conflict that didn't directly just immediately condemn Russia and praise Zelensky as a paragon of democracy. Things are becoming a little bit more hesitant these days. But that never existed in Central Asia. And I think a lot of that has to do with the idea that the region is geographically removed from the sphere of influence of the West, right? Sort of the EU's leverage is practically non-existent in a part of the world that the EU never has expected to expand to. The same thing goes with NATO. The United States is sort of a latecomer to the region in terms of its soft power diplomacy.
It's literally on the opposite side of the world, isn't it? If you put US in the mid, isn't it literally the other side?
Yeah, well, it's the simple reason for that. Yes, it's just the simple reason that the US had long disregarded Central Asia. In the 80s, if I can just give a little historical tour here, in the 80s, you probably or remember that there was the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. And the U.S., the CIA, had had praised the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as being freedom fighters, right? I mean, come on, I forget which Rambo movie it was. This movie is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan, which, once the war ends, we just kind of pack up and leave, and the Mujahideen kind of, morph into Al-Qaeda. And then once 9/11 hits, we pay attention to Central Asia because it's a good jumping ground to engage with Afghanistan, which interestingly enough is that in the 80s, the CIA was trying to see if they could stoke the same types of Islamic fundamentalism in Central Asia as a way of hitting the Soviet Union from its underbelly.
Well, the Uzbeks are a major tribe in Afghanistan, and they've been dominated by the Pashtuns. They've been dominated by a multitude of the different factions within Afghanistan for a long time, haven't they?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, eagle-eyed viewers will probably notice that I didn't include Pakistan or Afghanistan in this conversation, despite them ending in stands, because they're so inherently different. And I don't know if you would agree with this. generalization interpretation, but sort of that, that the five stands are predominantly Russia's backyard, or that's how people still consider it to be, whilst Afghanistan and Pakistan are more influenced from, India and Iran and the surrounding sort of. You don't think of the Central Asian states as the same exactly as the other two stands, but what how do you view that? Is that something you greatly differ with? And I come to mention it whilst we're on this theme. What of China? China is more active in the Central Asian region than I think we've seen in a while. So what about the Sino factor in this?
This idea of Pakistan, Afghanistan not being part of the stands is a general understanding. Yes, you're absolutely correct here. And I've heard from multiple places, people while I was over there, that if it wasn't for Russia, Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan would be like Afghanistan. Right? It would be like that, right? Because these countries, they have their, especially Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, they have their Islamic cores, right? They have their Islamic cores. They have their areas where in the region that are ethnic Uzbeks, Tajiks, their primary language is Russian because it still is the language of business. It's the language of the upper classes. That's not to say that these people forget their own identities, but it's just simply a way of decoupling the language with the identity, right? One just simply speaks it because that's the universal language within the region. And then to a lesser extent, you have Turkey, which Turkey perceives itself as like the big brother of Central Asia, right? That we are the most successful of the Turkic-speaking peoples. Wouldn't it be great if you worked with us? And Central Asia kind of looks at them and they're like, not really. Well, we like your gadgets, we like your money, and we like vacationing in Antalya and Istanbul. But other than that, this whole notion of like pan-Turkic identity doesn't really resonate past a couple of more ethno-nationalists within the region.
And given the
India is also seen as a growing country simply because of its. What's kind of funny is that India is sort of seen as the IT outsource country. They are now outsourcing their own ITs to Central Asia. So there are a number of these technical and engineering schools that I've seen in Tashkent and Almaty that are connected to Indian universities. So it's a way for some to, if they want to get into the tech industries, they want to get more of a professional training. The Indian schools are very much prevalent within these urban settings.
When it comes to Turkey, I mean, we've just had the election. Really good conversation I had with an expert, Gunal Tool, on that. Everyone's check that out. It'll be up here somewhere. And yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I believe Turkey has the largest proportion of Uyghurs refugee in the world, actually, which I had no idea, because you don't think of Turkey in context of Central Asia. I mean, just geographically speaking, that's not exactly the proximities next door. So that's a very interesting country that you raised there. And on that, Michael, I look forward to seeing what you come out with again. Everyone check out Michael's channel. Look forward to seeing you back here, hopefully for another conversation, perhaps about Ukraine and what it means for democracy.
Looking forward to it. It'd be great.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you around.